I'm here to present Judy Woodruff and Andrew Shennan. For several decades, Judy Woodruff has been a broadcast news anchor, a White House correspondent, and an author. A graduate of Duke University, she has been a trailblazer for women and girls in a historically male-dominated industry. She has worked for NBC, CNN, and is currently the anchor and managing editor at PBS NewsHour, which is now a majority female newsroom. Before launching her career, Woodruff was told by a prospective employer that she could not be hired as a reporter because he had already one female reporter on staff. However, in 2017, she was dubbed the Woman of the Hour by the New York Times. And in an era of a divided American public, where our fast-paced news cycle has incurred polarization and a loss of trust in news, her daily, hour-long, immersive broadcasts have increased viewership, actually, and continue to provide Americans with balanced and clear-eyed news. So for all these reasons, we're very grateful to have you here today. And she is joined by Andrew Shennan, our Provost, who oversees all academic programs at Wellesley. Over the course of the past 20 years, Provost Shennan has served as Wellesley's Associate Dean, and also as Wellesley's President during an interim period. He was founder of Wellesley's International Relations Program and directed the college's first summer school. He is also a historian, and at Wellesley has taught a range of courses in modern European history with a particular focus on the 20th century, the history of modern France, and World War II. Through these lenses as a historian and as an educator, Provost Shennan is very well poised to discuss with Judy how the role of media in society has evolved over time and into an age of populism. So thank you to you both very much for being here, and on to you now.
Thank you.
I think you have a mic already.
I do. Well, thank you, Charlotte, for that introduction. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
And Judy Woodruff, welcome to Wellesley.
Thank you.
And
It's
welcome
wonderful
to
to be
the
here.
Albright Institute. In the time that I've been at Wellesley, the creation of this institute is one of the real leaps forward. And it's a terrific program, partly because our students get to hear both from academics, but also from people who are, as it were, in the field, in different fields, addressing the issues of global concern in their different professional settings. And I don't think there could be a better time for us to meet to talk about the role of the media, of the broadcast media, of television in the world today. It's must be a very challenging moment to be working in that field. As Charlotte said, there is a moment of intense polarization, certainly in this country, but in a lot of other countries, as part of this phenomenon of populism. The press and the media have been identified, maybe to an unprecedented degree in this country, as an enemy, in some sense, of some portions of our society. And so I thought maybe to start off, you could share with us your thoughts about how you think about the role of a journalist in a moment of this kind of polarization and intensity within our political life.
Well, Provost Shennan, you're absolutely right. This is a moment like no other in my professional career. I've never seen anything like what the press, what the country is experiencing, and what the press is experiencing. But let me just first say how delighted I am to be back at Wellesley. You know, what a remarkable school, what a remarkable institution, and of course to be part of the Albright Institute in your 10th year. It's so exciting. I've known Secretary Albright for a long time, going back many administrations. And as she mentioned, she and I do see each other regularly. And she, you know, let the cat out of the bag. It's because we get our hair done at the same place in Washington. So we bump into each other, and it's usually very early in the morning. And you have to get there really early to beat her, because she usually has a 7 a.m. appointment, and I think mine's at 7:30 or 8. So, but this morning they let me in at 6. So. But it's one of the things, by the way, that women in public life have to think about. But she is a remarkable leader in our country, and I am an incredible admirer of hers, because all these years after she's left office, she continues to be so active, so giving, so involved. She's traveling, she's speaking, she's writing books, she's engaged and involved in giving here at Wellesley. And you heard it again this morning. So I'm so thrilled to have her as a friend, and then to now be at Wellesley to learn a little bit more about the program that is named after her. To your question, it is a moment like no other, as both of us said, and it has called for me and my colleagues at the NewsHour and so many people I know in journalism. It's called on us to think about what being a journalist is, because I came along at a time, I went to college in the 1960s, as you heard, graduated from Duke, never studied journalism, only decided to go into journalism after I was out of college. I had thought I was going to work first in math, and then I switched to political science, and thought I would work in Washington somehow in government. I didn't really have a clear idea of what it would be. And then, kind of a light bulb went off, one of those moments, frankly, because I was told that there weren't enough serious roles for women in government and politics. So it was for that reason that I turned to journalism, of course, only to discover that journalism was still figuring out a role for women. But for me, it's been a process of learning on the job. I didn't study how to be a reporter, how to be a journalist, what journalism is, the history of journalism. I had to learn all this as I went along. And so it's been trial by fire and baptism by fire in many instances. But what I was taught was that our job was to go and to record the important events of our time, and to do it faithfully, to do it accurately, to be always focused as we could on the truth, on getting to truth, and we can talk later about truth and what that means, and to keep my own views out of it. That I was an observer and a recorder, but I was not going into journalism to give my opinion. And so that's the journalism I've always practiced. And we've seen over time, that has, I think that's generally the way people think of reporters has been, but I think today we see an evolution in that, because more and more journalists are expressing their views. But I'll just say, because I want you to be asking questions and leading the conversation, Dean Shennan, I will just say that we are being tested today because we have a political leadership, and in particular, the most powerful person in the country, who is not only called into question, but is criticizing what we do, how we do it, questioning whether we are truly patriotic, whether we are enemies of the American people, these remarkable things that are just not true. And so, again, it's called on us as reporters to think about what we do, to think about why we're doing it. I'm more dedicated than I ever have been to the profession of journalism, to the craft of journalism. I think we've never needed great journalism and great reporting as we do today. So it's fired me up, and it's fired up a lot of my colleagues. But I'll be candid, it's been challenging. It's been truly challenging, because I think there are many Americans watching all this who don't know the history of journalism in this country, who basically have accepted what the president and others are saying, and who think, oh, well, they're there for themselves, and they're there to spread lies, and frankly, they believe what they're being told, even though it isn't true.
Thank you. I'd love to come on in a few minutes to talk about the president and how his presidency is changing the country, or changing the role of media. But maybe before we come to the president, because it seems like it's so easy for Trump to be the sole subject of conversation all the time, it's worth remembering that a lot of what we are experiencing in the modern era existed before.
Absolutely.
Before November 2016.
And in previous eras in this country.
And even, right, and so one of the things that strikes me is that the program that you run is a very different kind of news from the prevailing one that one sees on television at the moment. That is, it's deeply thoughtful, reflective, analytical, It doesn't so much feature people shouting at one another from their different positions. It's also, I think, trying to take a step back from the news to see what it means. And I just wonder, as a way of entering that conversation, how you reflect on the role of PBS or the NewsHour in an era when the pace of news, the news cycle, is accelerating to such an extent. Can you do it the way that you used to do it with the speed of the news cycle now? And what changes and adjustments do you think, if any, you have to make?
Well, it's impossible to ignore what's happened. I entered the room when you were discussing technology and the changes that's making, that's wrought in our lives and will continue to make. You can't function as a journalist today without being conscious of and participating in this rapid technological change that we're going through, the transition. I mean, we've already experienced great change particularly in broadcast, in television journalism, because when I started out, we were using film, 16 millimeter film, and we were processing the film. It went through what we call the soup, the processor, came out 35, 40 minutes later, and we had to edit the film and get it out onto the air. Then we moved to something called videotape, which you may have heard of. And then we moved on to another electronic form, and then eventually digital, and now everything is computerized. Everything we do practically comes out of a camera electronically and into a machine, and it's edited technologically. And it's edited in a way that we never ever dreamed of before. Having said that, it has changed everything we do. The speed of what we do, our ability to cover the news. We can go anywhere. We can do it. We can almost anywhere. We can't obviously go, if a government doesn't want us to go behind a door or behind a barrier, we can't do that. But we can be almost anywhere technologically. And we can listen, we can talk to people we couldn't talk to before. But we are very much driven by the speed of turnover, the fact that news is coming at us constantly. It's not just social media, it's the internet, it's everything. It's the world that we live in. We basically swim in a sea of news. And so we function at the NewsHour, which began in 1975 when my dear friends and colleagues Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil started the NewsHour on PBS. It was a half-hour news program, then it was an hour. But it was a place, like the broadcast networks, that set aside an hour, as I said, half an hour and then an hour, to look at the most important events of the day, the week, the month, the time. But today, what does that mean? That means you've got to interrupt all the noise, the chaos, the shouting, the opinion, the arguments. You've got to stop and say, this is what, at least this is our view. We're going to stop and we're going to put in 1 hour every night, Monday through Friday, the most important things that we think are happening. So we're asking you to just take a breath and look at it. And don't feel that you have to constantly check your Twitter feed, your whatever other news feed that you love. And here's what we think is important. And who is we? It's a group of journalists who have spent our lives, decades in my case, many decades in the case of most of my colleagues. We put our collective judgment together. We look at what's happened, whether it's at the White House, the Congress, foreign capitals, on the streets of America, in universities, in laboratories. We look at the news holistically, all of it, and we think, okay, what do people in this country who follow this program, what do they need to know today to get through their day, to get through their week? And that's how we boil it down. And we're constantly making judgment calls. We can't get it all on every day. We have to, even with our whole hour, we can't get it all on because we want to be thoughtful, we want to give time, we want to give perspective, we want to include historical context. And we can't do that with every story. And so there are days when we'll say, okay, today we're going to look at an environmental story, we're going to look at climate change. But we can't today get to, say, a story about, I don't know, some other, NASA development, space discovery, black holes, for example. There's been some discovery today that we want to put on the news, but we can't get to it. So we're constantly juggling that. And we have those discussions in the morning, we have a morning meeting, and then we talk about it all day long. So it's hard to convey what goes into those conversations, but I can tell you that they go on all the time, and they now start from the moment we open our eyes in the morning until the time we close our eyes at night. It's a constant process of taking in what's going on, sharing with each other, and deciding what are we going to put on the program.
So when you take that, it sounds like a great strategy to turn the machine off at some point, put it on the table, and just think about what it all adds up to. Is the pace at which things have been happening making it more challenging to be accurate in the way that you're
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're telling that story, whatever the story is?
Because as you all know, you follow the news. The news comes, I mean, if you follow, as we do, something called Data Miner, which now puts out, they put out the very first headline from a story, or not even a headline, just a little scrap of information from from all around the world. I use the word foreign, I mean everywhere. And it'll be, a shot was fired on the streets of Belgrade this morning, or something else happened. There was an earthquake in Chile, and we'll see the first line of that. How can that possibly be the whole story? How can that possibly be accurate? So we have come to understand that what we're doing, I think it was Ben Bradley, no, I guess it was Philip Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, who talked about journalism being the first rough draft of history. It truly is the rough draft. It's constantly changing. And we as reporters have to be, I think, every day very humble about what we know. We can't, what really bothers me is when we write a story and we write it as if this is authoritative, this is it, we now know what's going on. The fact is we only know what's going on up to this moment because we're waiting for new information to come in. We're waiting for people who haven't spoken yet. We're waiting for the other players in that story, the other actors, to weigh in. So we're constantly sort of massaging what we're doing. Yeah. And we don't want to mislead people at any given moment to say, this is everything you need to know about a story. Having said that, we still want to be driven by accuracy. We want to be as accurate as we possibly can be.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, Judy, those stories are coming in from all over the world all the time.
Yeah.
And seems appropriate in this group to ask how you think particularly about the coverage of stories relating to other parts of the world. I think it's true in every country I've ever lived in that most of the attention is focused on home, wherever home is. It's a responsibility, I think you'd agree, of journalists to give the audience a fuller view of the world than just what's happening at home. In fact, probably can't make sense of home without that. But also one's dealing then, the further away those countries are, the more distant the cultures, with a challenge of interesting an audience in the story. Could you talk a little bit about that, about how you think about that when you're talking with your colleagues in the newsroom, how you set those stories up to engage?
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about that, because when I started out as a journalist in the early 1970s, it was kind of a given that there was a balanced diet of domestic news and international news. The point came along, though, especially in local television, but then in national television, where more and more stations, television networks hired consultants to advise them on what kind of news should we be putting on the air to make sure we continue to have big audiences. Because we are, except for public broadcasting, most television news, as you know, it has commercials, and they are very, very attuned to ratings. How many eyes are watching? Pairs of eyes are watching. So these consultants would come in and they were constantly surveying. They were doing focus groups and polls of TV viewers, news consumers, and saying, what do you like to watch? What do you want to know? And I would say it was probably in the late 70s even, and 80s, when the advice came back, oh, well, the public really, they want to hear news you can use. They want to know about child safety, what's the safest car seat for a child? Perfectly understandable people would want to know that. They want to know about crime in their own neighborhood because they were seeing more of that on local news. One of the things they learned that people didn't want was at the bottom of the list of things they were interested in often was international news. Not everywhere, but that started to creep into the sort of the catechism, the set of beliefs that were shared with us. Well, the public isn't so interested in international news. And then you started to see news divisions, news organizations cutting back on international coverage. The networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, the newspapers cut back on their foreign coverage, cut back on the number of foreign bureaus. This happened in the 80s and the 90s. Along came cable news. Ted Turner created CNN in part because he felt it was crucial to start to cover international news again. That was the genesis of CNN. He wanted around-the-clock news, and he wanted it to be international. He felt international news was being overlooked. And so I'm condensing a lot into one answer. It's all by way of telling you that there have been ups and downs in international coverage. Right now, I think there's more than there has been. We tend to see more international news when we're at war, during the Iraq War, the Afghanistan, certainly back during Vietnam in our country. You look at periods of conflict when Americans are overseas fighting, or when there's some huge story, if you will, overseas, whether it's the Middle East or another part of the world. But I honestly believe that so many of these consultants did great damage to our news coverage. I think by their telling the leaders of news organizations that the public didn't care so much about international news, decisions were made that I think did a lot of damage over time. And I think we're bearing the fruits of that. Today, so much international coverage, news reporting is done by reporters who are freelancers, who are getting paid by nonprofit groups. They're doing amazing work. Right now, the NewsHour we have contracts with several correspondents who work for us as either freelancers or they may work with a consortium of independent nonprofit news organizations that have come together to pay their salaries to allow them to go into places of conflict and parts of the world that wouldn't otherwise be covered, be it on the African continent, in South America, Asia, and of course the Middle East, which gets so much coverage. I mean, and I will tell you, I'm so proud to say that a number of these foreign correspondents for the NewsHour are women. There's a woman named Jane Ferguson who has been in and out of Yemen where no other Western correspondents have gone at all. She's been in and out as recently as just a week or so ago, reporting on the famine, on the terrible impact of that war on women and children. And she's done, I think, award-winning reporting for us. She's done remarkable reporting. Another woman named Marcia Biggs has gone in and out of Iraq, even Syria. The two of them have put themselves in some of the most dangerous places on the planet. And these are women, and they're going in and they're basically winging it on their own. They don't have a little army of security guards. They do go in with what they call fixers, people who know the country and know the place that they're going. But it is very dangerous work. And I happen to be the co-founder of an international women's media organization. It's called the IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation, we started out in Washington. We were founded in 1990, and today, here we are 20-some years later, and we support women journalists around the world, and we've tried to raise money to support training programs, security programs, so we can have more, not just women, but also men journalists going out and doing this kind of important international reporting that we must have as Americans. We need to know what's going on in the rest of the world. And even if it's done by reporters who are, basically working on a shoestring, they don't have a big fat budget, like I said, to go in with an army of security, and which in the past that used to be the way it was. You'd go to cover the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq, and you'd go in with security guards and all the rest of it. It's much more, I know it's much more dangerous today, and I can say that because I haven't done it. I admire these reporters enormously who do the reporting that they do.
Thank you. That backstory about how international news became less prominent is something I'm not aware of.
And it was all about the commercial interest. How do we get more eyeballs? We don't put news on the air that people that they don't say they're fascinated by.
Right.
But I'm interrupting you here, but I think our job is to make these international stories interesting.
Absolutely.
So that people do feel compelled to watch and pay attention and learn from them.
And you mentioned that some of these correspondents whose work you particularly admire have been women working for you, and Charlotte mentioned in the introduction that your newsroom is highly unusual in the large number of women who are employed in it. And it's maybe a simplistic question, but does that change the way that the news is presented on NewsHour?
Well, I have to say that I'm so proud to work in the NewsHour newsroom, where we are led for the second time in a row by a woman executive producer. And you may know our executive producer, Sarah Just, whose mother, Marion, of course, is a longtime political science professor here at Wellesley. I think she just stepped down just this year. Maybe some of you had Professor Just, but her daughter, Sarah, is our executive producer. And we have a cast of amazing women producers, women you see on the air. Lisa Desjardins covers the Capitol. Yamiche Alcindor covers the White House for us. A woman named Amna Nawaz has been doing an amazing job covering the immigration story and other stories for us. And then so many others behind the camera who you wouldn't see. The question is, does it change what we do? And I would say yes and no. We've all learned to be journalists because we love journalism. We love covering the news. I love covering politics and so many other stories. Yamiche loves covering politics. That's how she came along. She particularly has been fascinated by the modern civil rights movement. She has focused a lot on that. Lisa Desjardins has covered the Hill because she too has loved politics. But we all bring our own background and our own interests. But at the same time, we're women. A number of us are, we're wives, mothers, daughters. And so we bring that experience to the table. And inevitably, what I like to say is that reporters bring the sum total of who we are to the table. When we're sitting around talking about what we're going to cover, or when we're thinking on our own about how to cover a story, we bring the sum of who we are, our experiences growing up. I grew up as a military brat. I was born in Oklahoma. I grew up living all around the world. I was in Germany and Taiwan, and I lived in New Jersey and Missouri and Oklahoma again, and North Carolina and Georgia. So I bring all of that. I bring my family's experiences together. I bring the experience of having lived in Washington for 40 years, being married to another journalist, being the mother of 3, including a son with a disability, set of disabilities. And so I bring all those experiences to the table, and they inform what I think about the news and how and what I'm interested in as a journalist, in addition to my professional sort of the kind of training that any journalist would have after all this time of doing what I do. And I would say that's the case with every other woman and man who presents as a journalist. And what's different about women is that, yes, we have had different experiences. We've sent our children off to school. We've worried about our babies, being sick in the middle of the night. We've juggled, getting paid less than men. We're used to having bosses tell us, at least I did, when I first found out that I was making a lot less than my co-anchor at a news station in Atlanta, a news program in Atlanta, Georgia, having the general manager of the station tell me, well, you're making very good money for a woman, Judy. I don't know why you would be concerned about making less. We bring all of that to the table. And so does it mean we cover the news differently? Sure. There are going to be stories that we're interested in that affect probably children, women, society in general, health, education, that are somewhat different from what men are interested in, and it's long overdue. And we also bring you know, the ability to cover wars, as I mentioned, you know, to be a Jane Ferguson or a Marcia Biggs and to go into a war zone and put our lives on the line. So is it materially different every day in what we do? No, but there are enough significant differences that we need it. I'll just say one final thing. I think every news organization should reflect the people we're reporting to. And so we're a national news program. We need to look like this country, and we need to be like this country. We need to be the faces of America. That's the reason it's so important for us to have a diverse newsroom, and we do.
Thinking more broadly than just PBS, but about media in general, obviously one of the most important developments of the past couple of years has been the emergence of the hashtag MeToo movement.
Yeah.
And which has also had an impact within media industry, within your business field as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, on the impact on the media world, or more broadly, the impact on American culture?
It's been an earthquake in, I hope it's been an earthquake in our country. It's certainly been an earthquake in our industry. Because what we are learning, I mean, many of us suspected this by our own experiences and by shared information with other women journalists. Mm-hmm. We've known that it's this kind of terrible, not just discrimination, but harassment, abuse, and worse was probably going on in large numbers, but we didn't fully appreciate how egregious it was until this has come to the surface in the last year and a half or so. And it really did, I guess, start with Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, but then it quickly became clear that it was, it's not just Hollywood, it's journalism, it's television journalism, print journalism, a lot of it turned out public broadcasting. We had our own share of men who were found to be some of the worst offenders, and as well as commercial, and we've now learned that it's across the board. I happen to suspect that it exists in every walk of life. It's wherever women and men are working alongside one another, and there's a power imbalance, which is everywhere. Then I think women have no doubt experienced harassment, abuse, and worse. It just is. And we've seen it happening to, it's happened to blue collar women. We've seen the lawsuits filed by women working in the hotel, hospitality industry. So it's across the board. But you asked about journalism. It's been a really disturbing series of disclosures. I mean, to learn that some of the people I had a lot of admiration for, people I've worked alongside, from Charlie Rose to Matt Lauer to, I could go on and name 4 or 5 others, to find out that they've have done what they've been accused of, even though in some instances they've denied it. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming in most of these cases, has been truly disturbing. And it's caused, I think, the women in the industry to come together and to say, we've got to support one another. I'm now on the advisory board of one organization that is Press Forward is the name of it, where it's essentially women journalists and some men who are focused on bringing all this out in public and talking about it and supporting women and saying, if you've had this happen to you, we're here for you, and if need be, we'll work with you on legal action. But essentially to say that news organizations and any other organizations, whether it's colleges and universities, private corporations, law firms, hospitals, whatever it is, if you've got any problem like this, you need to address it, and you need to basically make sure your employees know this is not acceptable, and it will not happen any longer. But women need to know that they're supported, because as recently as this month, we are hearing about cases where women have been harassed, abused, and worse, and they haven't felt they could come forward. So we have to talk about it. We have to keep on talking about it. It's not solved by any stretch of the imagination.
Thank you. I think we have to come to Trump. And maybe there's a connection there too. But one of the characteristics of the last couple of years has been the emergence of this concept of fake news, and also it seems like an endless stream of fabricated or distorted information that is being presented to the public, not just by the president, but certainly by the president. And I wonder to what extent this recasts your role as, to come back to the way you described what a good journalist does, as somebody who is interested in the truth. It almost feels like you could go crazy trying to catch all the untruths that are flying around. What do you do about that?
Well, it is what it's become is essentially something that we talk about every day in the work that we do. I've said since this administration came into office 2 years ago that when we started realizing during the campaign period and then during the presidency that we were going to be subjected to information from the highest levels of government that was not accurate, could not be borne out by facts, evidence, it caused me to have a catch in my throat, because we weren't used to having to correct the President of the United States and other leading officials. We were used to, sure, you're used to politicians spinning. No politician, they all want it to look like they're great. They don't, they want to be, they want a fan base. They want you to like what they're doing. They run for office. They want to get reelected. They don't like stories that are critical. So we're used to that. We're all accustomed to that. And the give and take and, the back and forth of the press and office holders, politicians. We're used to that. And so you're used to spinning. But what you're not accustomed to is just a sort of relentless dissemination of information from the very highest levels that is just wrong, that's inaccurate. I've said, and I'll say it again today, this morning, that I'm reluctant to use the word lies, because to me a lie says that you know for a fact that that person knew, himself or herself, that what they were saying was wrong, was inaccurate, was a lie. And they were saying it anyway. They were putting it out there anyway, whether in verbally or in writing. And I don't know that necessarily. I know plenty of my colleagues disagree with me. They say you got to call a lie. If it's a lie, call it a lie. I'm not there. I say to my colleagues at the NewsHour, I don't think we should do that. That's not our job. If somebody else wants to do that, we'll report on it. But it is our job to point out factual inaccuracies. If the president is saying something, whether it's about immigration, whether it's about trade policy, foreign policy, whether it's about why Russia went into Afghanistan in the first place, and on and on and on, whatever it is, if it's not borne out by the facts, it's our job to correct it. Do we have time every night to correct everything that came from the White House or another part of the administration or from somebody else? No, obviously not. So we have to pick and choose. What are the most important things that were said or disseminated that day that we think we need to set the record straight on? And we do that. We say the president said so-and-so, but we'll say, in fact, we may run a clip of the president saying it, and then we'll say, but in fact, the trade deficit last year was X. Or, the evidence is that, most people crossing the border are not criminals, or the vast majority are not, that most people who've broken the law, who've come into this country, are apprehended at airports or at ports of entry, legal ports of entry, not by jumping a fence or coming across the border, those kinds of things. So that's how we see it, but it is something we have to think about all the time now.
You must also have to think about how you, as members of the press, have become cast as enemies of the people. And how does that affect the way you do your job? And are you concerned that that could escalate beyond just the rhetorical into something that would really threaten the lives or the well-being of your colleagues?
Three things. Number one, it makes my blood boil. I'm furious when I hear anybody, especially the President of the United States, say that we're enemies of the people, enemies of the American people. We are here. And it's hard to lump all journalists together because we work for different news organizations. We compete with each other like crazy. Everybody loves to be the first with a story, but above all, we are driven. Those of us who I know, who I've worked alongside in the trenches, figuratively speaking, in Washington for all these years, what drives us is the facts, getting to the facts, getting to what really happened, understanding what happened and why and how, but getting it right. That's what drives us. And so for the president to say, or anybody else, to say that we're enemies, the people, when what is driving us is getting the facts right, getting it accurate, so that our democracy can be strong. That's why we do what we do. Which amendment to the Constitution speaks about a free press? The First Amendment. The Founding Fathers, I don't think, did that accidentally. They knew that a free press, was going to be one of the fundamental pillars of our democracy. You cannot have a democracy without a free press, just by definition. You all know this world far better than I did when I was your age. You understand what's going on. In the places where there is not a free press, there is not a democracy. There's not freedom. There isn't the ability to vote and select. And granted, we're not perfect in this country. I think the last time somebody measured us up against a number of Western European democracies, we were behind them because of some of the things that have happened going back previous administration. President Obama went after whistleblowers, went after people who were leaking to the press. So it's not that it's never happened before, it's happened in this country, but what's happening now is particularly worrying and disturbing, and it's something that we have to fight against constantly. So yes, it makes my blood boil because it's wrong, it's not true. It's the farthest thing, it's the opposite of the truth. Number two, it cannot affect what we do. I think the last thing we should do as journalists is get into a conflict with the President of the United States. We should do our jobs, we should report on what's going on, we should go after the facts, try to nail down what happened, understand what happened, get to the sources, get to the evidence, put it in our stories, share it with the public. That's our job. Not to get into some sort of contest with the president or anybody else. And third, I'm very worried that it is spreading. You asked, am I worried that it's going to lead to, copycats? That we already see in other countries. Have other leaders like Duterte in the Philippines and various other authoritarian leaders around the world are now talking about fake news. Yeah. They feel, I think, emboldened to some extent by what's come out of the United States to do that. So in essence, what's happened here has given strength to some of these other regimes, which are already repressive. It's given them the sort of the green light to be even more repressive, to hear what's coming out of this country. So I'm very worried about it, about what it could mean for the future, and I'm worried that many Americans agree with what they're hearing from Washington. They think, oh yeah, okay, I guess the press really is opinionated. And they do watch a lot of cable news, and you turn on the internet, you look at your iPhone, and you see a lot of opinion, and not all of it's accurate. And so, we've got to it's really important that we educate not just your generation, but the younger children who are coming up through school now to discern the difference between reporting and opinion. That's never been more important than it is now.
The Secretary Albright, as you know, has written a book about this phenomenon of populism, and President Trump and other figures around the world with similar kind of politics. And I think one of the points that she makes in that book is that you can think of this kind of politics as an ideology, but it may be the wrong way to think about it. That it's there's a method of acquiring and retaining power, which is really involved in exploiting people's animosities, insecurities, fears about the world. And that trying to make it into a coherent ideology may not be the right way to think about that kind of politics. It does seem that President Trump's politics over the years, or ideologies, have ranged widely, to say the least. What are your thoughts about that way of thinking about this phenomenon of populism?
I don't know that President Trump has thought about populism. I don't know that he's studied it or thought about the phenomenon of populism and how he's using it to advance his presidency. And I use that term very deliberately because I don't think there is a particular philosophy. Yes, some of what he believes conservatives like. There's some of what he believes trade policy that some liberals like. There are other you can sort of pick and choose. And you're right. I mean, his view of policies have shifted over time. Very different views today from what he held 20, 30 years ago, and even more recently. And frankly, even since last year, I mean, we've seen shifts since he's been in power. I don't know that he personally thinks about how he uses populism, how populism fits with what he does. But I do think he thinks a lot about how to hold an audience and how to gain the support of as many people as possible at one time. I think he learned a lot from watching entertainment figures over time. He grew up in New York City. He watched New York politicians. He, he had his own career, as you know, in the in the real estate business, where he was competing with other real estate developers, and he was trying very hard to get as much coverage as he could in the New York tabloids. So he did a very good job at it. I mean, it's now well known that he would pick up the phone and call reporters to try to get into the newspaper. So I think he's a master because of his own efforts over many, many years of working with the press, interacting with the press, dealing with the press, which is frankly makes it all the more fascinating now that he's trashing the press, criticizing the press, when he's depended on the news media to make him who he is today. And of course, he jumped into the world of entertainment in his career as a reality TV host, star, whatever. And so I think he's learned a lot from that, and I think he's picked up on Twitter and has run with it, and he's realized with his 50 or 60 million followers, he can have a big impact at one time. So I'm reluctant to use the term populism. I think for the rest of us, we can think about how to impose the term populism on what he does, but I don't think he thinks of it that way.
That's very interesting. There are people moving around the room at the back, which suggests that we are coming to the end of our time. But if I could maybe ask just one last question to take us in a more, hopefully a more positive direction. When I was growing up, the Watergate scandal and the role of the American press in revealing it, in pulling the curtain back, sort of set, I was growing up in a different country, set an example of truth-telling and holding powerful people to accountability that was inspiring. As you look to the future and to our Albright Fellows generation, are you confident that the press can continue to play that role, will continue to play that role?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the reason is that as long as most of us recognize how important it is that we have this democracy in this country, this remarkable experiment that, from 1776 until today, it's been tested, it's been tried. I know a lot of people think it's never been tested before as it is today. I would say, well, we went through 2 world wars, we went through a civil war, and we've been through many, sort of internal moments of tumult and change and testing, and we've been buffeted from all directions. We've stood the tests time after time. So I'm confident, based on that, from where I sit, that we're going to get through this. We're going to come out of it even stronger. I think the press, in many ways, is going to come out of this even stronger because we've been tested and challenged the way we are right now. So I think the press will stay strong. I think the press will what I hope is that more and more Americans will understand the role of the press in our society. And I think that's why what we're doing right now, what we do and how we cover the news right now, it's so important for us to share that with the American people so that they get why what we do matters. But we have to keep talking about it, and we have to do it in ways that captures. It can't be this sort of esoteric conversation. It can be that, it should be that, but it also needs to be at a ground level. We need to go out and engage with people. We need to get out in the country. We need to talk with people as journalists about why we do what we do. I will just say this as a final comment. I think in the 2016 election, there were many reporters who kind of stayed in our coastal enclaves, and we didn't really get out there and talk to enough Americans and engage with Americans. And we missed what was happening in the country in 2016 as a result. We can't do that again. We need to engage. We need to reflect the whole country. We can't just be seen as these coastal elites who all, went to Ivy League schools, great schools like Wellesley and other schools, which are phenomenal and do a fantastic job of educating journalists and other leaders in our country. But we have to reflect this whole country because we will lose people if we don't engage with them.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.